It's hard to imagine today, but there was a moment in American history when capitalism didn't just feel unfair, it felt unstable, combustible, almost suicidal. The country was getting richer faster than any nation on earth, but that wealth was pulling in the hands of a tiny elite. For everyone else, life was a grind of dangerous work, violent boom and bust cycles, and a political system that seemed owned, body and soul, by the men who controlled the money. It wasn't just inequality, it was imbalance, the kind that bends a society until it's ready to snap. And at the time, the idea that the government could do anything about it seemed impossible. The oligarchs were too powerful, the political machine to compromise, the system too entrenched. Yet this was also the moment when America would attempt something radical, to fix capitalism before capitalism destroyed the country. Welcome to the financial historian where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand just how close the country came to breaking, you have to step into the late 1800s, an era of explosive growth and almost no rules. Railroads stitched the continent together. Steel poured into skyscrapers and factories, or lit the world, and big finance fueled every expansion. It was the birth of a modern economy, but it came with a darker twin, the rise of private empires that overshadowed the national one. John D. Rockefeller didn't just dominate the oil market. He dictated its terms, J.P. Morgan didn't just run a bank. He could move the entire economy with a phone call. Andrew Carnegie, Jay Gould, and others built systems where competition wasn't something you wanted, it was something you eliminated. They formed trusts, secret pools, and interlocking directorates to crush rivals and fix prices. Wealth wasn't just concentrated, it was weaponized. They controlled the flow of goods, money, and information, creating a new form of power that seemed to answer to no one but itself. Meanwhile, the working class endured a reality that feels almost dystopian today. 12 to 14-hour shifts were standard. Coal miners inhaled death slowly. Steel workers died quickly in fiery accidents. Children as young as 8 were sent into factories and mines, not because parents were cruel, but because survival demanded it. There were no safety regulations, no social protections, no unemployment insurance, no minimum wage. If you died on the job, the company just replaced you. If you got sick or injured, you were fired. If you protested, they called in private detectives, militias, or even federal troops to break the strikes with force. The economy grew, but it grew in ways that punished the people powering it. This wasn't a bug in the system. For many industrialists, it was a feature. The political system offered little relief. In fact, it was often part of the problem. Senators were effectively for sale, bribed with corporate money or installed through political machines that answered to the industrial magnates. Mark Twain famously called it the Gilded Age, because on the surface everything looked shiny and golden, but underneath it was rotten. Newspapers were bought by trusts to shape public opinion, pushing narratives that favored big business and demonized labor. Even the courts often sided with the corporations they were supposed to restrain, striking down early attempts at regulation as an infringement on liberty of contract, the liberty of a desperate woe. To accept any terms offered by a powerful employer. Democracy wasn't dead, but it was compromised to the point that for many Americans, the government looked less like a public institution and more like a subsidiary of the railroads, steel companies, and banks. And then came the crashes. The Panic of 1873 triggered a depression so deep it lasted 6 years. Banks collapsed, railroads went bankrupt, and unemployment soared to levels never seen before. The country had barely recovered when it convulsed again in the panic of 1893, an even more brutal downturn. Hundreds of banks and thousands of businesses failed. 1 in 5 American workers lost their job. People starved in the streets of cities that were filled with unprecedented wealth. These weren't random accidents. They were built into the unregulated, hyper-speculative system. J.P. Morgan famously had to step in and personally bail out the U.S. government, a move that showcased just how much power had shifted from Washington to Wall Street. This combination of extreme wealth, desperate poverty, political corruption, and economic instability created a powder keg. Across the country, anger boiled over. Farmers, squeezed by railroad monopolies and predatory lenders, formed the populist movement, demanding public ownership of railroads and a more flexible money supply. Factory workers, pushed to the brink, organized into unions and launched massive, often violent, strikes. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Haymarket Affair, the Homestead Strike, the Pullman Strike, these weren't just labor disputes. They were pitched battles that left dozens dead and entire cities under martial law. Anarchists, socialists, and radical organizers gained followings, arguing that the whole system was rigged and needed to be torn down. America felt like it was coming apart at the seams. The question on everyone's mind wasn't whether the system would change, but whether it would explode. But from within this chaos, a different idea began to emerge. A new generation of journalists, activists, and politicians started asking a revolutionary question. What if the government wasn't the tool of the powerful, but the tool of the people? What if democracy could be used to tame the excesses of capitalism? These were the muckrakers, journalists like Ida Tarbell, who exposed the ruthless tactics of Standard Oil, and Upton Sinclair, whose novel The Jungle revealed the horrifying conditions of the meat-packing industry. Their stories shocked the nation and created a powerful demand for change. This public outcry gave rise to the progressive movement, a broad and diverse coalition that aimed to reform society from the ground up. They fought to break up the giant trusts, regulate railroad rates, and establish safety standards in factories. They pushed for a federal income tax, so the burden of government wouldn't fall solely on working people and farmers. They campaigned for the direct election of senators to wrestle control away from the corporate-backed state legislatures. They fought for women's suffrage, believing that a broader democracy would be a fair one. And then, the figure arrived in the White House who embodied this new spirit, Theodore Roosevelt. An aristocrat by birth but a reformer by conviction, Roosevelt believed that capitalism was the best engine for progress, but only if it was properly regulated. He famously declared that he was not against big business, but against its misconduct. He earned the nickname Trust Buster by taking on J.P. Morgan's railroad monopoly and winning. He used the power of his office, what he called the bully pulpit, to champion the cause of the square deal for the common man. He signed into law the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, establishing the principle that the government had a responsibility to protect consumers. He set aside millions of acres of land for national parks, conserving natural resources from corporate exploitation. Roosevelt wasn't a socialist. He was trying to save capitalism from itself. He and the progressives who followed, like William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson, argued that without rules, without a referee, the game would be destroyed by its most powerful players. They established the Federal Reserve to manage the money supply and prevent the kind of financial panics that had crippled the nation. They created the Federal Trade Commission to police unfair business practices. They passed child labor laws and pushed for the 8-hour workday. None of this was easy. Every reform was met with ferocious opposition from the vested interests who benefited from the old system. They called Roosevelt a traitor to his class, a radical, a dictator. They spent fortunes lobbying against new regulations. But the momentum of public opinion was too strong to ignore. The balance of power, which had tilted so dangerously toward the oligarchs, was slowly, painstakingly, being pulled back toward the center. What the progressive era accomplished was a radical reimagining of the role of government. It established the idea that a modern industrial economy requires a modern regulatory state to ensure fairness, stability, and public safety. It wasn't about destroying wealth, but about ensuring that the benefits of that wealth were shared more broadly. It was the beginning of the American safety net, the framework that would later be expanded by the New Deal and the Great Society. Looking back from the 21st century, the Gilded Age seems like a distant, almost alien world. Yet the questions it raised are startlingly familiar. What is the proper balance between free markets and government regulation? How do we prevent wealth concentration from corrupting democracy? What do we owe the people who power our economy? The battle fought over a century ago to fix capitalism before it broke the country is a battle that, in many ways, never truly ended. The story of that era is a reminder that the system we have is not inevitable. It was built, it was challenged, and it was reformed by people who dared to believe that a better, fairer society was possible. Thank you for joining us on The Financial Historian. If you found this story compelling, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next dive into the history of money and power. Let us know in the comments what you think. Are we living in a new Gilded Age today? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time.
Imagine an America where a handful of men held the entire economy in their grip. A time of glittering fortunes and grinding poverty, where panics could wipe out businesses overnight and workers were shot in the streets for demanding a living wage. This wasn't some distant, abstract history lesson. This was the Gilded Age, and in many ways, we're living in its shadow today. In the late 19th century, America was a pressure cooker. Events like the Panic of 1873 and the Great Strike of 1877 weren't just financial blips. They were systemic earthquakes, revealing an economy that was dangerously unstable and controlled by private interests so powerful they could crash the whole system on a whim. Americans realized the game wasn't just unfair, it was rigged. But here's the part of the story we often forget: they fought back. The country didn't just surrender to the idea that monopolies were inevitable or that workers were disposable. An unlikely coalition of journalists, reformers, lawyers, and even presidents decided to draw a line in the sand. The Gilded Age didn't just collapse, America confronted it head-on. The first major blow was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. On paper, it was simple: conspiracies to restrain trade were illegal. In practice, it was weak at first, courts were hostile, and corporations found endless loopholes. But its real power wasn't in immediate results. It was a declaration: the economy is not the private property of a few powerful men. It's a public space, and public spaces have rules. Then came the journalists, the muckrakers. Ida Tarbell meticulously exposed the brutal tactics of Standard Oil, shattering its carefully crafted public image. Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, revealed the horrifying, unsanitary conditions of the meat-packing industry. This wasn't about ideology. It was about raw, visceral disgust. Americans saw what unregulated capitalism looked like behind the curtain, and they were appalled. Public opinion turned, and reform went from a radical idea to a national survival strategy. The real turning point came with a force of nature named Theodore Roosevelt. Energetic, theatrical, and brilliant, Roosevelt knew that a president couldn't just enforce rules. He had to write the story of what a fair economy should be. When he took on J.P. Morgan's massive railroad monopoly, the Northern Securities Company, It wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a signal to the world: the era of untouchable corporate empires is over. Roosevelt didn't hate big business. He hated business so big it became a threat to democracy itself. But even Roosevelt couldn't stop the next crisis. During the Panic of 1907, the financial system froze. And who stepped in? Not the government. It was J.P. Morgan, acting as a one-man central bank. He literally locked the nation's top bankers in his library and forced them to fix the crisis. It worked, but it terrified everyone. The idea that one private citizen held that much power over the nation's fate was unacceptable. The result: in 1913, America created the Federal Reserve, a direct response to ensure that the country's economic lifeblood would never again be controlled by a single individual. The wave of reform spread. Child labor laws began pulling kids out of factories and putting them in schools. Workplace safety standards started to emerge. The 8-hour workday, once a pipe dream, became a tangible goal. And with the 16th Amendment, the federal income tax gave the government a powerful tool to counterbalance the immense concentration of wealth at the very top. For a time, it worked. America didn't destroy capitalism, it disciplined it. It bent the system to serve the many, not just the few. But history has a funny way of repeating itself. As the decades wore on, the very guardrails that had saved the system began to rust and fade. The reforms weren't defeated, they were forgotten. And in economics, forgetting is a choice. It's a slow drift, an erosion of rules driven by lobbying, influence, and the return of a seductive old myth that markets regulate themselves, that concentrated wealth is efficient, and that private greed somehow automatically produces public good. The progressive era was born from crisis, but as prosperity returned in the mid-20th century, the memory of that crisis faded. By the 1970s and 80s, a new philosophy took over. Regulation was seen as a burden. Antitrust was old-fashioned. Unions were obstacles. And taxing the wealthy was treated as not just bad economics, but morally wrong. And so, piece by piece, the guardrails were dismantled. Finance was deregulated. Massive corporate mergers went unchallenged. Tax rates on the wealthiest Americans plummeted. Campaign finance laws were weakened, letting a flood of private money pour into our politics. Unions crumbled as jobs were automated, sent overseas, or union busting became standard corporate practice. It didn't happen all at once. It was death by 1,000 legislative cuts, each one sold as modernization, each one quietly restoring power to the very forces the progressives had fought to contain. And the numbers today tell the story. The top 1% of Americans now hold more wealth than the entire middle class combined. The bottom half of the country holds just over 2% of the nation's wealth. The top 0.01%, a group so small you could fit them in a single sports arena, controls a share of wealth comparable to the robber barons of the Gilded Age. In one recent year alone, just 19 of America's richest families saw their collective net worth increase by $1 trillion. If these numbers feel like they're straight out of 1890, it's because they are. The architecture of inequality, the very structure that our great-grandparents fought so hard to dismantle, has been rebuilt. It's sleeker now, more global, and better insulated from democratic pressure. We are living in a new Gilded Age. The question is, what will we do about it? The past shows us that change is possible, but it doesn't happen by accident. It happens beyond just the massive wealth gap. The labor situation today feels like a strange echo of the past. The Gilded Age was infamous for its dangerous jobs, no safety nets, and children toiling away in factories and mines. Now, of course, we're not sending kids down coal shafts, but look closer. For decades, wages for most people have barely budged. Meanwhile, the cost of housing and healthcare has skyrocketed. Millions are stuck in the gig economy, juggling part-time jobs with zero stability and no benefits. And if you think child labor is a thing of the past, think again. Some states are actually rolling back protections, letting teenagers work longer hours, later nights, and in more dangerous jobs. A century ago, reformers fought tooth and nail to get kids out of the workplace. Today, some politicians are quietly letting them back in. The industries and the language are different, but the economic squeeze is the same. When the system gets strained, the first protections to go are always the ones for the most vulnerable. At the same time, corporate power has evolved into something the old progressives couldn't have even imagined. Think about the old monopolies. Standard Oil is now big tech. U.S. Steel has become global private equity. The powerful railroad trusts have transformed into digital platforms that control everything: supply chains, advertising, what we buy, our data, entire economic ecosystems. The old robber barons bought newspapers to control the narrative. The new titans shape the entire information environment itself, using algorithms, invisibly, and on a scale that would make a Gilded Age magnate's head spin. And just like a century ago, our political system seems powerless to stop them. It's not that we don't have the laws, it's that enforcement has been gutted. Lobbying has become a fire hose of cash, and the idea of just letting the market handle it has become the default answer for both political parties. So, here we are again, an era of breathtaking wealth for a few, fragile lives for the many, a political system captured by special interests, and a public that's getting more and more frustrated. It's a second Gilded Age, dressed in modern clothes but running the exact same playbook. And when you look at it like that, it's easy to feel pessimistic, to feel like we're just stuck in a loop. But that's not the real lesson of this story. The most important lesson from the first progressive era wasn't despair, it was transformation. The extreme pressure of inequality didn't actually break the country. It forced it to change. And this is the part that truly matters for us right now. The United States didn't fix the problems of the Gilded Age by accident. It wasn't luck. It wasn't the rich suddenly becoming charitable. And it definitely wasn't the invisible hand of the market magically correcting itself. Real, lasting reform happened for a reason. It happened because ordinary people got organized and demanded it. It happened because brave journalists exposed corruption and abuse. It happened because politicians finally felt enough pressure from voters that they had to act. It happened because major crises, like financial panics and labor strikes, forced the entire nation to face the high cost of letting private empires run wild without any limits. None of those forces have vanished. They're still here, just lying dormant, waiting for us to wake them up. The tools that once reigned in unchecked capitalism are still part of our system. They exist in our legal code, in past court decisions, and in our institutional memory. The concept of antitrust, breaking up monopolies, is still on the books. Protections for workers can be strengthened. Social safety nets can be rebuilt and expanded. The rules that govern Wall Street and high finance can be restored and enforced. It is simply not true that the system is too broken to fix. What's true is that our collective will to fix it has flickered. It burns bright in times of crisis, but it fades when things feel comfortable. But history shows us one thing very clearly: the pendulum always swings back. Societies simply cannot survive these extreme levels of inequality forever without something giving way. And that, right there, is where the hope lies. If the Gilded Age taught us anything, it's that the rules of our economy not written in stone. They aren't laws of nature, they are made by people. They are shaped by politics and enforced by our institutions. And when they stop serving the public good, they can be, and have been, rewritten. Yes, the wealthy have incredible influence, but this country is bigger and more powerful than any small group of elites. That was true in 1900, and it is just as true today. The fact that our current inequality looks so much like the Gilded Age isn't a sign that reform is impossible. It's the opposite. It's the clearest sign that reform is absolutely necessary. The feeling that the system is unbalanced and unfair is the alarm bell telling us that a new era of reform is long overdue. A century ago, Americans completely reimagined their economy. They broke up giant monopolies. They fought for and won protections for workers. They regulated the financial system. They built the very foundations of the American middle class. They didn't do it perfectly, and they weren't all united, but they did it. And the reason they succeeded is the same reason we can succeed now, because the rules of the economy are human-made, and what humans make, humans can change. History doesn't repeat itself perfectly, but it often rhymes. And the last time things looked this unequal, this unbalanced, the country didn't fall apart. It fought back, it rewrote the rules. It forced capitalism to work for the many, not just the few. That isn't just nostalgia. That's a precedent. That's our roadmap. If this gave you a new way to think about where we are today, make sure you subscribe and follow for more. The past holds the answers we need for the future, and I'll show you exactly where to find them. Thanks for watching.